Fred and George had been gone 10 minutes or so when the portrait hole opened and Hermione climbed into the common room, carrying a sheaf of parchment in one hand and a box whose contents rattled as she walked in the other. Crookshanks arched his back, purring. "Hello," she said. "I've just finished." "So have I," said Ron triumphantly, throwing down his quill. Hermione sat down, laid the things she was carrying in an empty armchair, and pulled Ron's predictions towards her. "Not going to have a very good month, are you?" she said sardonically, as Crookshanks curled up in her lap. "Oh, well, at least I'm forewarned," Ron yawned. "You seem to be drowning twice," said Hermione. "Oh, am I?" said Ron, peering down at his predictions. "I better change one of them to getting trampled by a rampaging hippogriff." "Don't you think it's a bit obvious that you've made these up?" said Hermione. "How dare you?" said Ron, in mock outrage. "We've been working like house elves here." Hermione raised her eyebrows. "It's just an expression," said Ron hastily. Harry laid down his quill too, having just finished predicting his own death by decapitation. "What's in the box?" he asked, pointing at it. "Funny you would ask. You should ask," said Hermione, with a nasty look at Ron. She took off the lid and showed them the contents. Inside were about 50 badges, all of different colours, but all bearing the same letters, S-P-E-W. "Spew," said Harry, picking up a badge and looking at it. "What's this about?" "Not spew," said Hermione impatiently. "It's S-P-E-W. Stands for the Society for Promotion of Elfish Rights, or Welfare, sorry." "Never heard of it," said Ron. "Well, of course you haven't," said Hermione briskly. "I've only just started it." "Oh, yeah?" said Ron, in a mild surprise. "How many members have you got?" "Well, if you two join, 3, said Hermione. "And do you think that we want to walk around wearing badges saying spew, do you?" said Ron. "S-P-E-W, said Hermione hotly. "I was going to put stop the outrageous abuse of our fellow magical creatures and campaign for the change in their legal status, but it wouldn't fit. So, that's the heading of our manifesto." She brandished the sheaf of parchment at them. "I've been researching it thoroughly in the library. Elf enslavement goes back centuries. I can't believe no one's done anything about it before now." "Hermione, open your ears," said Ron loudly. "They like it. They like being enslaved." "Our short-term aims," said Hermione, speaking even more loudly than Ron, and acting as though she hadn't heard a word, "are to secure house elves fair wages and working conditions. Our long-term aims include changing the laws about non-wand use and trying to get an elf into the Department of Regulation of Control of Magical Creatures because they're shockingly underrepresented." "And how do we do all of this?" Harry asked. "We start by recruiting members," said Hermione happily. "I thought 2 sickles to join. That buys a badge, and the proceeds can fund our leaflet campaign. You're treasurer, Ron, so I've got you a collection tin upstairs, and Harry, you're secretary, so you might want to write down everything I'm saying now as a record of our first meeting." There was a pause in which Hermione beamed at the pair of them, and Harry sat torn between exasperation at Hermione and amusement at the look on Ron's face. The silence was broken not by Ron, who in any case looked as though he was temporarily dumbstruck, but by a soft tap-tap on the window. Harry looked across the now empty common room and saw, illuminated by the moonlight, a snowy owl perched on the window-sill. "Hedwig!" he shouted, and he launched himself out of his chair and across the room to pull open the window. Hedwig flew inside, soared across the room, and landed on the table on top of Harry's predictions. "About time," said Harry, hurrying after her. "She's got an answer," said Ron excitedly, pointing at the grubby piece of parchment tied to Hedwig's leg. Harry hastily untied it and sat down to read it, whereupon Hedwig fluttered onto his knee and tooted softly. "What does it say?" Hermione asked, breathlessly. The letter was very short and looked as though it had been scrawled in a great hurry. Harry read aloud. "Harry, I'm flying north immediately. This news about your scar is the latest of a series of strange rumours that have reached me here. If it hurts again, go straight to Dumbledore. They're saying that he's got Mad Eye out of retirement, which means that he's reading the signs, even if no one else is. I'll be in touch soon. Best my best to Ron and Hermione. Keep your eyes open, Harry. Sirius. Harry looked at Ron and Hermione, who stared back at him. He's flying north, Hermione whispered. He's coming back. Dumbledore's reading what sign? Said Ron, looking perplexed. Harry, what's up? For Harry had just hit himself in the forehead with his fist, jolting Hedwig out of his lap. I shouldn't have told him, Harry said furiously. What do you want about? Said Ron, surprised. It's made him think that he's got to come back, said Harry, now slamming his fist on the table so that Hedwig landed on the back of Ron's chair, hooting indignantly. Coming back? Because he thinks that I'm in trouble, and there's nothing wrong with me. I haven't got anything for you, Harry snapped at Hedwig, who was clicking her beak expectantly. You'll have to go back to the owlery if you want food. Hedwig gave him an extremely offended look and took off for the open window, cuffing him around the head with her outstretched wing as she went. Harry, Hermione began, in a pacifying sort of voice. I'm going to bed, said Harry shortly. See you in the morning. Upstairs in the dormitory, he pulled on his pajamas and got into his four-poster, but he didn't feel remotely tired. If Sirius came back and got caught, it would be Harry's fault. Why hadn't he kept his mouth shut? A few seconds' pain, and he'd had to blab. If he just had the sense to keep it to himself. He heard Ron come up into the dormitory a short while later, but he did not speak to him. For a long time Harry lay staring up at the dark canopy of his bed. The dormitory was completely silent, and he had been less preoccupied. Harry would have realized that the absence of Neville's usual snores meant that he was not the only one lying awake. Chapter 15. Beauxbatons and Durmstrang. Early next morning, Harry woke with a plan fully formed in his mind, as though his sleeping brain had been working on it all night. He got up, dressed in the pale dawn light, left the dormitory without waking Ron, and went back down to the deserted common room. Here he took a piece of parchment from the table upon which his divination homework still lay, and wrote the following letter. Dear Sirius, I reckon I just imagined my skull hurting. I was half asleep when I wrote to you last time. There's no point in coming back. Everything's fine here. Don't worry about me. My head feels completely normal. Harry. He then climbed out of the portrait hole, up through the silent castle, held up only briefly by Peeves, who tried to overturn a large vase on him halfway along the fourth-floor corridor, finally arriving at the owlery, which was situated at the top of the west tower. The owlery was a circular stone room, rather cold and draughty, because none of the windows had glass in them. The floor was entirely covered in straw, owl droppings, and the regurgitated skeletons of mice and voles. Hundreds upon hundreds of owls, of every breed imaginable, were nestled here on perches that rose right up to the top of the tower, nearly all of them asleep, though here and there a round amber eye glared at Harry. He spotted Hedwig nestled between a barn owl and a tawny, and hurried over to her, sliding a little on the dropping-strewn floor. It took him a little while to persuade her to wake up, and then to look at him as she kept shuffling around on her perch, showing him her tail. She was evidently still furious about his lack of gratitude the previous night. In the end, it was Harry's suggestion that she might be too tired, and that perhaps he should ask Ron to borrow Pidwigin, that made her stick out her leg, and allow him to tie the letter to it. Just find him, all right, Harry said, stroking her back as he carried her on his arm to one of the holes in the wall, before the Dementors do. She nipped his finger, perhaps rather harder than she would ordinarily have done, but hooted softly in a reassuring sort of way all the same. Then she spread her wings and took off into the sunrise. Harry watched her out of sight with the familiar feeling of unease back in his stomach. He had been so sure that Sirius's reply would alleviate his worries rather than increase them. That was a lie, Harry, said Hermione sharply over breakfast, when he told her and Ron what he had done. You didn't imagine your skull hurting, and you know it. So what? Said Harry. He's not going back to Azkaban because of me. Drop it. said Ron sharply to Hermione as she opened her mouth to argue some more, and for once Hermione heeded him and fell silent.